Welcome to the Divorcing Religion YouTube channel, where you'll find episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast, the Conference on Religious Trauma, and the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference. Don't miss my interviews with great guests like Seth Andrews, Dr. Daryl Ray, and author Margaret Atwood, talking about religion and religious trauma syndrome. Become a member for more benefits, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss new content. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. Just a quick reminder that tickets are on sale now. You can get the early bird special for Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture. I'm hosting that event live in Seattle next year in 2025. So you can get your early bird tickets at shamelesssexuality.org. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome my guest today, a fellow Canadian. Korrenne Jensen is a registered psychotherapist in Ontario. She has been working in the field since the 2020 pandemic, when she started her career in grief work in a hospice setting. Kory works within the areas of religious trauma, ADHD support, and grief. She also works with populations that include frontline healthcare workers, first responders, and indigenous individuals. She's the clinical director of Afterglow Psychotherapy and additionally enjoys growing on social media with a page called unconditionally.healing that explores mental health with humor and vulnerability. Welcome, Kory. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's nice to see you too.
I got to say, I love the name you've chosen for your practice, Afterglow. That just has such a lovely, positive vibe to it.
Thank you. It was a hard decision to make. It's really kind of like naming a child. You have to do it on your own and figure out which one you want to go with.
Yeah, well, I think you chose a great one, and I'm curious about your own history growing up. If religion was part of your family or anything that influenced you at all.
Sure. Yeah. So my growing up was a little bit different. I know quite a few people that had similar upbringings to me, so it doesn't feel that unusual. But I grew up fairly involved in the church. I was also homeschooled. So in my area in Ontario, those things are kind of intertwined, that there's not necessarily homeschool groups that are non-religious. So the homeschool groups we were a part of were also religious. And then I was part of some non-denominational or evangelical faiths growing up. I also did attend Christian university for my first round at university. So it was pretty much my childhood until my early adulthood that I was involved in that.
Wow. And so if you're comfortable, where would you put yourself now on that spectrum? Would you still call yourself a believer, or have you walked away?
I would say that it was a very long deconversion and deconstruction process. And at the start, it was more around throwing the baby out with the bathwater, for lack of a better term. I was more done with everything associated with it. I couldn't even look at certain groups for a while, because even groups that felt similar, like say I was a vegetarian for a while, and some friends wanted me to become a vegan, and even that felt too close to Christianity in some ways. It just felt very
it's fundamentalist.
Strict fundamentals, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So I would say over the years, a lot of things have changed. I've let go of a lot of my anger and a lot of my resentment that I felt, but I still don't find myself necessarily wanting to partake. I think that my views on spirituality, I was probably atheist when I first was deconverting and deconstructing, and I'd say maybe leaning a little bit more in the agnostic realms nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So how did your mom take it? Or does the family know? Because that can be such a tricky line to navigate when our loved ones remain deeply entrenched in something. We have no problem still loving them and interacting with them, but some of them can have issue with us no longer believing.
Hmm. I think there was a lot of fear about all of it at the beginning. Friends that I had still in religion, family members I still had in religion. And I think that that's probably why it was almost like a 6-year process for myself, because it was something I was holding on to maybe for the wrong reasons at times, where I just really wanted to please the people in my life. So I found that when I was vulnerable and I actually started speaking up and explaining a little bit of how I got to this destination, I was very surprised. I had the pleasure of having people in my life that are fairly open to growth. And so I found that I could have these conversations. I did lose some friendships. I did lose some relationships. I mean, that's just going to happen, I think, over your lifespan as well. But I'd say overall, everyone took it pretty well and has been pretty open to me as a person still. And I think that they see a lot of the growth that I'm doing. And I hope that that's affirming to them that maybe I'm making some good decisions for myself.
Wow. That I'm so happy for you. That's wonderful to know that you still have kind of a core group of people that are in your
Mhm.
life that support you. Was there something specifically that made you start questioning at first, at the beginning of those 6 years?
Hmm. There was an event that occurred where one of my very close friends, she lost her fiance, and at the time I was very involved with a lot of different Christian groups, and everybody was very active in participating in prayer and wanting to show up in that way. And then I found that after, when he did unfortunately pass, that it was very crickety. There was not there was not
Oh,
really anyone checking in. There wasn't anybody, it was kind of like they didn't get the miracle they wanted and then didn't know what to do with that afterwards.
right.
And so I lost a lot of relationships during that time because I was pretty upset with the aftermath of it. I didn't
Mhm.
understand why they were all there at the beginning and then they weren't there when things got hard, I guess. And so, luckily, I've had some really good conversations with some of those folks, and they've actually made some really good changes in their lives too, and been really able to reconcile some of that time in my life. But I'd say
Mm.
that was kind of the spark that ignited the doubt. The second spark that kind of lit the match was I went and brought my partner, who I started dating back in 2015, to church with me for the first time. And the very first sermon, pastor I've seen many, many times, out of the blue, just kind of started off by saying, just to be clear, love is only meant to be between a man and a woman. And it was the first time I was kind of hit with something so abrasive in my
Dear.
face where I couldn't ignore it. They weren't dancing around it. And
Yeah.
my partner, his mom is queer. So it was just
Oh,
very like, oh, of course I brought them to this one and this is just
oh,
awful. And this is, yeah. So it was one of those situations that it just really made you start having to look at things because it was just so abrasive and so in my face. And then additionally, I'd say, jump forward maybe 6 years, I started actually unpacking my own sexuality that had been put in a very locked away box with lots
hmm.
of lots of protection around it.
Yeah.
And I think once I started really doing that, that was like, okay, I feel as though I had to hide a part of who I was my entire life. I felt as though I could not choose to explore with a woman or be with a woman. And I am a bisexual person. I've always been a bisexual person. And choosing to walk away gave me the ability to love and accept myself for that. So
Girl, same.
you
Same.
get
Wow.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. It's like listening to myself. That's very interesting. And it's such a everybody's journey, their deconstruction or deconversion journey, is unique to themselves. And then it also feels like there are some common threads. And it can be a really painful experience and also intensely liberating. It's really, if someone is on this journey and they're watching or listening to us today, I hope they feel encouraged and inspired that they're allowed to be themselves. And it's good to question. There should be nothing that we can't question. So thank you for sharing those personal details about your journey. Now I'm curious about the work that you do, because one thing that you mentioned to me when we were talking the other day was that autism spectrum disorder and ADHD and religious trauma, there can be some intersection, some crossover there. And that was super interesting to me. Tell us a little bit about your journey of learning about those things.
So it's interesting because I did a mentoring program through my university. I went to Yorkville for my master's, and they have a mentoring program to kind of support new students. And one of the things that was asked of me recently was like, how did you find your niche? Like, how did you find your thing that you work with? And I feel as though it found me, and it found me in a really fascinating way because I never set out to work with religious trauma or ADHD or grief. They all just kind of found me. And fascinating enough, I didn't actually know I had ADHD until after starting to work with ADHD so much, is that I've had this understanding and this way of kind of grasping what somebody was saying that's neurodiverse in a way that felt so, oh, that's fascinating. I probably have this as well then.
Wow. So kind of eye-opening and a puzzle piece clicking into place there for you as you listened to other people and learned and then recognized some of those traits in yourself. Very interesting. So the grief piece also in the introduction we talked about a little bit. Did that come about in the hospice work specifically as a result of the pandemic, or were you already leaning in that direction before the pandemic?
So when I actually was booking where I would be doing my internship, that we didn't know anything about the pandemic at that point. So you do your application so early. I was in more like 2019 era, and I was doing my training for the hospice, and that's actually when the pandemic started happening. And they were gracious enough to take me on. I was at Dr. Bob Kemp Hospice in Hamilton, and they are incredible. They're very I just have a lot of gratitude towards them because they really helped me with my education. And I found that a lot of people at that time during the pandemic either could not find a placement or their placement was canceled due to the pandemic because no one knew how to navigate it. So I'm very grateful they let me stay there and do my work. But yeah, it was not anticipated. It was more just that I needed a placement and I was looking around and they were somewhere that I had a connection to. So I ended up there.
Wow, that reminds me, it just takes me back a little bit when I was first working on my own designation as registered professional counselor. The supervisor that I chose, even though he was religious, he worked at a funeral home. And he had done that for years and was just so skilled in grief work. And I thought, boy, I could learn a lot from this person who's a funeral director. And he was so satisfied with his job. Like he said, it's a very satisfying thing. If you can meet people when they're at the depths of despair in their life, and they know that you're a solid person who can help guide them through this process. So that was, people struggle, I think Christians especially, can have real issues around death and dying. It doesn't really get dealt with because when we attend Christian funerals, we're told we don't mourn as the world mourns. We don't grieve as the world grieves because we're going to be united in heaven again. And that can really short circuit the grieving process. There is a sadness, there is a finality to losing someone and not having them there to talk to turn to anymore. So I'm grateful when people who are not religious move into the grief and loss and bereavement realm. And that's something that you still do in addition to the other work.
Yeah, I would say it's probably about a third of my workload is grief work. I like to say that we don't know if we'll ever experience, say, like anxiety in our lifetime. Well, we'll experience it on a base level of I'm experiencing fear, but like say an anxiety disorder or panic attacks, we may not experience that. But grief, we know we will experience it. Is that we talk a lot about mindfulness, but we don't talk a lot about grief tools. And grief is something that we know for certain we will go through. Something that I found really fascinating that you're saying too around Christianity kind of implementing itself in the grief realm is that it's almost like we're not looking at grief as though it's actually a state that we're entering, right? It's almost like a fog that comes into our life. It's not an emotion that we're engaging with. If I engage with anger, I'm almost playing with anger a little bit, where I think of something that makes me angry and it builds and it builds, where grief is like this fog that just comes into my life and it's something that's happening to me. And I'm living through the process of grief. So to say that we shouldn't be grieving a certain way or that we shouldn't feel sad, that's not really in our control in that way because it's happening to us.
Oh, that's so true. And unfortunately, people do tend to jump into cliches, which are just horrible, telling the grieving person, oh, so-and-so is in a better place, God needed another angel, whatever it is they're trying to say. I would say, just don't. And if you're not sure what to say, I'm sorry for your loss is appropriate. And can I help is appropriate, showing up with a meal, hiring a laundry service, whatever it may be, rather than, just using cliches. I actually want to show you something. So I wonder if you are aware of it. It's a game that I purchased online. It's called Start with Hello, and it's a conversation game, and it's all about death, living and dying, and things that people don't usually talk about. But I think, especially for people doing grief work, could be really helpful. I do recommend it to the therapists that I know, because when else are you actually going to be talking with your loved ones about, okay, so if you're in a terrible accident and you need someone to help with all your activities of daily living, showering, everything, who's the last person you would ever want to help and who's the first person that you would want? We don't have those conversations. Or when you think about a memorial service or a funeral for yourself, what music do you want? Just basic things like that can be so helpful in preparing us for our loved ones' loss or our loved ones for our own loss. We need to think about these things and talk about them. So, yeah. Oh, good. I'm so glad that I could show you that game because I wanted to let you know about that. Grief is just so powerful. Yeah. Okay, now, would you talk a little bit about the intersection that you discovered or you noticed when it comes to ADHD or ASD and religious trauma? Because you said something about it the other day, and it just blew my mind because it really seemed to make sense.
So I had just been noticing this pattern. I'm in a position where I have some friends who are still involved in the church, and I respect that decision. I have no issue with that. I also do feel great gratitude for those who have left the church in some ways, because they just have an understanding of what I'm going through and a perspective of what I'm going through that is just a little unique to that situation. You work with religious trauma. I think it's one of the most unique traumas that's out there, really. Because you have to kind of have the language to know it. So one of the things I noticed with the individuals that had left the church was that all of these people were neurodiverse. And so seeing it myself, and it was kind of like this slow build, right? Is that I got diagnosed, someone else got diagnosed, we all just slowly got our diagnosis. And I think one part of it is that we don't talk enough about mental health in church. And I think that that's something that's really important to talk about. And it's almost as though I noticed that the neurodiverse folks that were raised in church the same way that I was took things just a little bit more seriously, and it had a negative effect on their mental health. So, like, if we were to compare like a neurotypical mindset versus a neurodiverse mindset, there may have been almost this feeling of, the neurotypical person can just pray for their family and then go to bed. And then the neurodiverse person is going to hyperfixate on what you've said about that and not understand directly what you mean about that, and might stay up till 3 a.m. praying for every single person they've ever met because they're going to feel maybe guilt or shame if they do it wrong. And so I think that it caused a lot of mental distress on a lot of these people. And they're even kind of finding and having these conversations around this of, I think I took it more seriously than the rest of you guys. I really do. I feel like I was very literal in my black and white thinking of it. And whenever I heard something, I wanted to do it right. I wanted to do it perfectly, but I wasn't recognizing any nuance connected to it. So I found that kind of fascinating. And I think helpful maybe for us to be aware of when we notice the stress that's coming up in children. So say someone does want to indoctrinate their child, just noticing those little cues that you might see of, is this causing them distress? Is this keeping them up at night? Is this something, do I notice other neurodiverse traits about them that maybe is connected to this too?
Right. And so if we think in terms of scrupulosity or religious OCD, that is something that is actually rewarded in some church settings. If someone is, praying 50 times a day or whatever, and then the church is like, wow, that person's a real prayer warrior. They really have a heart for God. And they encourage that type of unbalanced behavior and the black and white thinking and the rigidity. I think of it back in the 70s, there was a Christian recording artist who wrote a ton of worship songs. His name was Keith Green, and the book about his life was called No Compromise, because that's how he lived his life. And he was really lauded and heralded and looked up to. And he actually had what I now see as a cult compound called Last Days Ministries, and he put out all these religious tracts. But in the 70s and 80s, he was really seen as that, that should be an example for the life that you live of no compromise. And instead, what I find now that I'm no longer religious is that the world is not black and white. It is many shades of gray and many other colors. And it takes a certain level of emotional maturity and depth to be able to navigate that and find the nuance, rather than before I was so comfortable and stuck on rules. That was the only way I felt like I could really succeed. And so then when I had grown up Pentecostal, but then when I found there were Mennonites, Holdeman Mennonites, and the women covered their hair and just dressed very modestly. And I was like, there's more rules. I was giddy. There are more rules that I can follow here and be even holier and get it even more right. Because there was such a fear, because the cost was too high. If I got it wrong, I didn't want to go to hell, and I didn't want my children to go to hell because of my laziness or however I misinterpreted all that. And so I kept myself wound so tightly. It was like Christianity was a corset, pulled tighter and tighter. And then one day it just snapped. It just busted and everything came falling out. And it's very messy and shocking and sad at the time and scary, because it's not what I planned. I never imagined not being a devout believer. That just seemed too far out of the realm of possibility. So those were crazy
being
times.
Okay with that. Being okay that that's not where you ended up, and that's okay.
Right. And even at the time, I didn't know anyone else. I went several years after losing my faith before I actually found out about an author, a religious trauma pioneer named Dr. Marlene Winnell in the United States. And Dr. Winnell wrote a book called Leaving the Fold. And once I connected with Dr. Winnell, then I finally started meeting other people who had been as devout as I had been and walked away from it all and survived. And were living happy, healthy, productive lives, because I didn't see how that was possible. And I just felt, my overall feeling was like I had woken up out of a dream. I had come out of a cult. That's what it felt like, even though my churches were kind of mainstream denomination churches, my thinking really had been hijacked and was very, very fundamentalist.
Yeah, so it's almost like I picture, like, if there was half of the church congregation is neurospicy and the other half is neurotypical, is that the half that are sitting there that are neurospicy, if they don't have awareness about their neurodiversities, if they don't have the knowledge of what's going on for them, they're going to think that they're taking everything the same way as everybody else, but they're not. And, you know, maybe it would be helpful for it to be studied at some point. I think that would be really interesting to see those intersections play out statistically. So I'm only seeing it in my own, you know, bubble at this point. But something I thought was interesting you're talking about with almost that rewarded, like you get rewarded for doing that, is that if we look at ADHD in girls, that's often why it gets missed so much, is because it gets rewarded, because it doesn't show up in running around in the classroom. It shows up in my brain can't turn off at 3 a.m. and I'm becoming a perfectionist with my schoolwork. And I've had executive functioning issues. I didn't get this assignment done. Now I'm beating myself up, but I'm still handing the assignment in on time because all of this is going on behind the scenes and we don't see it. So when we look at how this shows up in the burnout in the church, I mean, goodness, I don't think there's a single person that's been to church that hasn't seen somebody go through burnout or burning themselves out.
Well, yes. And what I understood to be normal in the church when my ex-husband was pastoring, so I was a pastor's wife, it was expected and just normal that 10% of the people do 90% of the work. And you know, of those 10%, boy, a lot of them are women just holding it together, just keeping everything running. And you do it and you do it and you do it until you can't do it anymore. And that's so unhealthy. And then for those of us who were raised and trained in that environment, that's often how we live the rest of our lives. And I remember when I was married, just feeling exhausted all the time, that I was trying, not only was I homeschooling the kids, you know, when they were little and trying to be a pastor's wife, and constantly putting out fires in the church, you know, socially, this sort of thing. And I just felt like I could never quite get enough rest. Like it was like treading water constantly all the time and having to just feeling so responsible for everybody else. And then you're living in a fishbowl too when you're a pastor or missionary family. It's very difficult and everybody has an opinion on how you're doing and what you're doing. So it was kind of good for me to be able to be away from that. But one thing I still notice all these years later, and I've been away from Christianity. I divorced my religion about 14 years ago. But if you look around my den, it is not very tidy. You see behind me, and that part looks tidy, but there's piles and stacks and things that I've started, and I'll wake up in the morning, and I've got a new husband now, and I'll wake him up, and I'm like, I just had the best idea, and then I'll tell him all about it, and I'll run to the computer, I'll type out my idea, and then months go by, and I'm like, oh yeah, what about that idea I had? Because it's just one of 50 other ideas that I have. I'm always starting things, and it seems really hard to finish them, to stick with it. So maybe I should sign up for some testing somewhere. That might make sense. Do those things sound familiar to you?
Oh, sure. I mean, if we actually look at the ADHD assessment, that's part of the assessment is, do you have any trouble starting if it takes a lot of planning? Do you have any trouble finishing up the last little bits of a project, especially if it's boring or if it's not something that you're interested in? And so I think we see these things play out a lot. And yeah, it almost feels like a formula, right? It does feel like this formula of repression and masking, where I remember having so many times where I knew what I was thinking. Like I knew my true thought on a situation, and I knew I was being gaslit, and I knew there was nothing I could do about it, and that I needed to comply because it was what was best for me at the time. And so you kind of wear this mask, and I didn't know I was wearing a mask because I thought that was who I really was inside, was not who I was supposed to be. That was sinful. That was wrong. And I needed to get far away from that person and become more like God. And so it was just very It's just been so many layers, right? When I look back and reflect on it, I can't believe it's happened because it's been almost like a 10-year process at this point. And it just, every stage of it was different. Every stage of deconstruction and deconversion is different.
Wow. You know, when I first started wearing a head covering, because I started seeing these women in the grocery store in our small town in Alberta where the Bible college was. And these women would come in and they looked so different because they always had a head covering and dressed so modestly. And I said to my husband at the time, you know, are they Amish? I didn't know we had Amish here. And he says, no, they're just a brand of a Mennonite. And actually, the New Testament is where it talks about women covering, and it's not like they were excused from doing it. Women just don't do it. So then when I ran home and looked it up in the Bible and the lexicon and the concordance and all the big Bible type books, and I thought, wow, yeah, we've never been excused from this. Everybody else is doing it wrong. Like these people are actually doing it right. So then um, I got rid of all my jewelry, like stopped wearing my wedding ring, got rid of all my pants and shorts, just went for long dresses and jumpers and this sort of thing. And then I knew at that time that my marriage was very difficult because my husband and I just had really different temperaments and approached things differently. And I was very gregarious, bubbly, opinionated. Uh, and I felt like that must have been what was troubling the marriage. And so to me, I thought, if I'm putting on this symbol of submission every day that I see and that everybody else sees, I'm talking about the head covering, that is my reminder to zip it, to just be quiet, to just try and fade more into the background. And because I've believed that he was given to me by God as my head, my spiritual head, the leader of our family, in reality, that's not the type of person he was. He wanted an equal partner, but I didn't feel like the Bible said we were to be equal partners. And so I was thrusting us both into positions that felt unnatural to us, but I felt like it's the rules. We have to follow the rules. The rules say you have to be the leader and I have to be the follower. So get busy, get leading, and I'll just put on my head covering here. But it took years for me to recognize that that's actually what was going on, and it really did come out of that desire to please, to be obedient to God. And I wanted God to be so happy with what I was doing. And I wanted my parents to feel proud of me, and I wanted to do everything right.
Yeah. Yeah. That perfectionism really gets in the way of vulnerability. We cannot access both at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. And it's really hard to have a healthy relationship if you can't be vulnerable. Both parties need to be willing to be vulnerable rather than moving into some kind of holiness competition. Who's being more holy? Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong? Oh, I better pray and get all my girlfriends on the prayer line to pray for my husband because he, plays World of Warcraft or whatever, the thing was, rather than turning towards each other to actually talk about what's going on. Religion complicates things.
There was a speech I saw from a professor, and I'll see if I can find the information. It was kind of the beginning of my deconversion, so I'm not quite sure. Someone sent it to me, but one of the things I really liked that they talked about was personality development and indoctrination. And so you need two aspects. You need exploration and you need commitment. So in terms of commitment, religion has no problem with that. We can get the commitment piece down. But if we're not able to explore, if we're not able to actually see, is this for me? Is this not for me? Then it impacts our personality development. And there's a lot of emotional immaturity that I saw in the church. There's a lot of emotional immaturity I see in the world in general, but it's just not something that's really called out as much, I think, in those environments because it's so normalized. And there's even times I've thought about, are people mean? Or like, is there more mean people in the world? But it's more that I was always around people who were fairly pleasant, whether or not it was real. They were always very pleasant. So it's one of those things that you kind of start looking at your world differently, but you're not always looking at the reason why it might be showing up differently. Is that maybe that person who's being rude on the street actually is just being a little more real and more vulnerable, and they're not being, sneaky or conniving or gossiping about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think I definitely, when I left the church, I didn't necessarily leave my fundamentalism behind, my black and white thinking, but also I kept my rose-colored glasses on. And I heard Rachel Bernstein say on her podcast, a red flag just looks like a normal flag if you're wearing rose-colored glasses. And that is just so true. And so my marriage came to an end, and I jumped into, other relationships and friendships with the expectation that because I'm an honest person, other people would, of course, be honest with me. And I didn't have a lot of experience in the real world. And I got sorely burned in different friendships and romantic relationships. And I felt like I had to toughen up, because in the church, everybody was pleasant, and there's rules about how you're supposed to treat people. So I mean that was kind of nice in the church to have that feeling of safety there, but I felt that I was shortchanged then, because I didn't have a proper understanding of reality and how reality works.
And I think that's something that I wish people could understand that have a problem with people deconverting or deconstructing, is the pain that we feel in leaving it. Is that it's not an easy decision. It's not easy to walk away. It's the most terrifying thing you'll ever do. It's just one of those things that once you start seeing things a different way, like once your mind has been expanded in certain ways, you can't put yourself back into the box that it was once in. You just, it doesn't fit anymore. And so I find that a lot of people feel a lot of grief around losing their faith. They feel a lot of confusion around, how do I forgive? Because I was always taught to forgive by giving it to somebody else. How do I learn how to forgive others and myself? How do I learn to trust when my faith has always been given to somebody else to take, watch over me? How do I learn how to trust my own abilities, my own intuition, myself? It's something that is very challenging for people. And I think there's an extra layer for the neurodiverse folks that didn't get the access to the care that they maybe needed when they were young as well.
Yes. Yeah. Especially if that was missed by their parents sometimes, and also because discipline can really be a huge issue in the church, unfortunately, and it can lead to abuse. And if you have a child that is neurodiverse and it shows up in different ways, they can really be punished by the parents and the Sunday school teachers and the church and the Christian school teachers for not fitting in and towing the line. And the child is not trying to be objectionable. Their brain just works differently, but they can really suffer terribly for that. And it's so unfair. So I'm really glad to be having this conversation with you and to see it become more mainstream, that people are becoming more understanding of neurodiversity and how common it actually is and what it can look like for different people. The grief idea as well, I think, is so important for those of us who really believed very strongly and firmly and devoutly. So we lose our identity as a religious believer. We lose the religious community. We lose our entire worldview. The only way the world has ever made sense to us no longer makes sense. And we're left thinking, what else am I believing that everybody else knows isn't true or realistic, but nobody told me. So it becomes hard to trust ourselves. But the intense grief that we feel, there's no body to bury. And people who have never experienced it don't understand it. So I could say to my employer, oh, I just had to put my dog down, or my dog died, or whatever. And the employer can say, wow, take the afternoon off, don't come in for a day, whatever it is. But when I say, oh my God, my entire worldview has just disintegrated around me, they don't understand that. They say, oh, so you just stopped believing in Santa Claus? Okay, well, you better be at work on time. So there's not the understanding or compassion in related to the losses, the significant losses that we've suffered. And then people can move into trying to numb that grief. And this is where addiction and so forth can seemingly come out of nowhere. Of course, it never really does come out of nowhere, but it's just so much pain there.
Yeah, I think there's an answer that you hear a lot. I mean, I heard it a lot growing up, was that when people would leave, is that they've fallen away, the lost sheep kind of mentality. Is that I think it's a lot harder to look at the complexities of organized religion and look at how it does cause harm and cause trauma, and how it affects people's self-worth, how they feel about themselves is really directly connected to how the church feels about them in a lot of ways growing up there.
Wow. And I mean, it's also just true that within the church, we're told over and over again to be a child of God. No one's told to be an adult of God. And there can be an immature mindset that takes root there, partly also because we try and externalize our power source. We are taught we have to always be seeking confirmation, pray, ask the Holy Spirit, go to your pastor or a man to tell you what you should do. And we're not taught how to think for ourselves and how to make wise decisions. And in fact, we're taught the opposite, that our heart is deceitful and wicked and can't be trusted.
Yeah.
That seems so crazy. That seems like a terrible way to set people up in the world. That's like it be setting them up to fail.
It's just so fascinating too, because a lot of it is kind of like the do as I say, not as I do kind of thing as well. So I think a lot of folks do take it to heart, and they take all of that stuff really on of like, I need to show up, I need to be perfect. But as we know, perfect is a myth, and we're not able to actually be perfect. So there's always going to be cracks, and in those cracks, there's usually shame. So
shame is such a big one. And shame is, I saw a cartoon that encapsulated it perfectly. I wish I could remember who's behind the cartoon, but it was essentially a person with a big bag that's tied up with a bow, and it says shame on it. And they're trying to hand it to another person. They're saying, here you go. But the other person crosses their arms and say, no, thank you. I don't want it. I refuse to take your shame. And I wish that more people could think of it in that way, because shame is something that's typically put onto us by another person who has some kind of shame issue because they were indoctrinated at some point along the way. So I really encourage people to swap judgment for curiosity whenever they can, and just gain experience trying new things out there. You can even try on and take off identities. And we might do that multiple times through the course of our life.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for like that growth mindset as opposed to like a set mindset. And I find that when you're in a structure, you have to have a set mindset. It's not really open to that exploration. So when you're in a growth mindset, you're open to experience, and you don't have to take those experiences on and say, I tried water polo, now I'm a water polo person for the rest of my life. Is that I'm maybe just open to trying it and seeing how I feel afterwards. Is that it's almost like that's the building of the trust, is that I'm going to explore and trust myself to see how I feel about doing something.
Oh, yeah. And how we talk to ourselves is so important. I mean, you might try water polo and just fail miserably at it. And you might realize, wow, that I never want to do that again. That is definitely not for me. But we can speak to ourselves in an encouraging way and say, good for you for trying that thing that you never tried before. What's next? What else would you like to try? Instead of being hung up on the fact that we weren't able to be a pro and be perfect at it right off the bat, because that's the kind of pressure I think that we can end up putting on ourselves when it comes to, I have to be perfect at everything. And then we get bogged down and unwilling to try because we don't want to be imperfect.
I would be very fascinated to know the statistics on how many, like, I think we have some awareness that not everybody that is raised in the church or goes to church has read the whole Bible in its entirety. And I'd be really fascinated to know how many people who have and have read it multiple times are neurodiverse. Because that takes a hyperfixation mind in my opinion, is that I just see a lot of folks that were neurodiverse and did read the Bible inside and out several times. That was kind of like the nail in the coffin for them, is that they just found so many discrepancies, so many things that didn't add up. And I just am curious, because they do take it so black and white, is that they took the instruction of, you need to read this word, and they did it. And then a lot of them found that maybe they didn't understand how it worked and all the intricacies of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, boy, I met more than one person who deconstructed and deconverted while they were attending Bible college, because they just saw too many discrepancies there. But then there were an awful lot of us who just worked harder at it, try and make those pieces fit, try and jam them in there, or just ignore the offensive parts where a man is prepared to slaughter his own son. We would just call that profoundly unwell today with our understanding of mental health and mental illness. But that's not what we're taught in the church. We're taught how incredibly devoted to God this person was. So it's a real, it screws with your mind, put it that way.
Absolutely. There was a podcast I listened to in my early on process, and it was Born Again. It was a couple that both, I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it ever, but they kind of went through some of those stories in the Bible too. And it was just really validating. I was a new parent at the time. So when I'd hear a story of like Adam and Eve getting kind of like one chance and then we're doomed for the rest of our lives, it was, their response to it was kind of like, that's just not very good parenting, if you ask me. And I was like, that's kind of a good point.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think it can be even important for us to consider the parenting that we received and the messages that we received. And that can have to do with how we talk to ourselves now, because for a lot of us, we have to go back and reparent ourselves, that inner child who was shut down and shamed and whatever else was going on there. And now that we have assumed control of our own lives, we're behaving as autonomous individuals, it's really in our favor to choose to be compassionate with ourselves rather than to beat ourselves up. And I think of, if there's a parent and a child, and the child knocks the cup of milk over onto the floor, one parent might stand up and yell at the child, "How could you be so stupid?" Another parent might say, "Oh, oops, okay, what's happened? How do you think we should clean this up? What will do it? Should we use a paper towel? Should we use a regular towel? Should we use a piece of paper?" You can use it as a teachable moment with that child. And then the child feels like you're on their side. And you're going to do it together. We're both going to clean up this mess. And next time we'll move the milk farther away from the edge so it doesn't happen again. And then the child doesn't feel shame for that thing that they've done. And to me, that just seems so, to me, that's common sense parenting. But if you didn't receive that type of parenting, that might not be the first thing that comes to your mind. So it can be helpful exploring our own journey through childhood and adolescence with imperfect parents who themselves were indoctrinated and may have a touch of neurodivergence as well. Like, you just don't know until you stop and really consider these things.
I think about too with Janina Fisher's work when she talks about how a child doesn't really have the ability to look at the parents and think, I don't think they have what they need to help me right now. Right. So they
Right.
only have the option to go inward and say, it must be me. I must be the
Mm,
problem. I'm not a good enough kid. If I was a better kid, I would get the things I need. And,
mhm.
if we think about God being taught in the way of a parent, it's kind of like a similar relationship where we're always doubting ourselves. Like, it must be me. I must always be the problem. And that's such a hard way to live. And then in turn also find some love or compassion for yourself.
That's so true. Wow. Yes. And then, of course, that invasiveness of a God who can read your mind. We say he's different from Santa Claus, but he is keeping a list and he does see everything that you do. And so, first it's our parents and then our teachers, kind of Sunday school teachers, maybe watching us to see if we fall out of line. Eventually we internalize it and we don't need them because we're constantly giving ourselves the message that we're in danger or we're not safe or we're doing something wrong. And that can be really hard to deal with later in life when we recognize if we've walked away from religion, realizing that is no longer serving us, but we can still have that real intense drive towards perfectionism. And so then that's when I encourage people to seek out the help of a qualified mental health professional,
Mm-hmm.
such as you, such as me. Um, how can people find you if they'd like to access your services?
Sure. So my website is just www.afterglowpsychotherapy.com, or I am on Instagram at afterglow.psychotherapy, or my unconditionally.healing as well. So I believe you'll probably link it on the bottom for people. You'll do all the fancy behind the
I
scenes work.
will.
So.
Yes, you bet. Wow. This was really nice to get to talk with you and hear a little bit more about your own personal experience and how you shifted into the work that you're doing now. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. And I hope to maybe come and see you in Seattle for your event.
Oh, that will be so awesome. It's going to be a good one. Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope to see you again soon. Take care.